Why killing Louis XVI was the French Revolution's biggest mistake, historical evidence reveals. The air inside the Temple prison in January 1793 did not smell of the lilies and expensive perfumes of Versailles. It smelled of damp stone, tallow candles, and the cold, biting breath of a Parisian winter that seemed determined to freeze the very soul of the monarchy. Inside these thick medieval walls, a man sat by a small fire, rubbing his hands together. To the world outside, he was Louis XVI, the descendant of the Sun King, the man whose ancestors had ruled France for nearly 1,000 years by divine right. But to the guards standing outside his door, men who wore the red, white and blue cockades of the Revolution, he was merely Louis Capet, citizen Capet, a prisoner of the people. This man, who once held the power of life and death over millions, was now waiting for a group of lawyers and radicals to decide if he deserved to breathe. What many did not realize at that moment was that the trial of Louis XVI was never truly about justice. It was a desperate political gamble, a blood-soaked bribe intended to anchor the new republic in a way that could never be undone. But as the ink dried on the death warrant, a terrible truth began to emerge. The execution of the king would not be the triumph of the revolution. It would be its greatest catastrophe. By choosing to kill the man they had already neutralized, the revolutionaries were not securing liberty. They were murdering their own legitimacy and opening a door to a darkness that would eventually consume them all. To understand why this was such a fatal miscalculation, we have to look past the stone walls of the prison and see the man as he was. Louis was not a monster. He was not a tyrant like Caligula or a warmonger like Louis XIV. He was a quiet, introverted man who preferred lockmaking and hunting to the cutthroat politics of the court. He had inherited a kingdom on the brink of bankruptcy, a social system that was rotting from within, and a hunger in the streets that no amount of royal decree could satisfy. When the Bastille fell in 1789, Louis didn't respond with a massacre. He tried to adapt. He accepted the tricolour cockade. He agreed to become a constitutional monarch. For 3 years, France hovered in a strange experimental limbo. It was possible, even likely, that France could have become a stable parliamentary system, much like Great Britain. But the atmosphere in Paris was changing. The moderate voices that sought reform were being drowned out by the screams of the sans-culottes and the cold, calculated logic of men like Maximilien Robespierre. The shift from reform to regicide happened in the shadows of paranoia. In the summer of 1792, the atmosphere in Paris was thick with the scent of blood and fear. Foreign armies, led by the Prussians and Austrians, were marching toward the French borders, promising to level Paris to the ground if the king was harmed. This was the spark that lit the powder keg. To the radicals, the king was no longer a symbol of the state. He was a traitor in their midst, a secret ally to the invaders. On August 10, 1792, a massive mob of armed citizens and federated troops stormed the Tuileries Palace. The Swiss Guard was slaughtered in the hallways, their bodies stripped and mutilated. Louis and his family fled to the National Assembly, seeking protection, but they found only a cold reception. The monarchy was suspended, the Republic was declared, and Louis was moved to the Temple, a fortress that had once belonged to the Knights Templar, now repurposed as a cage for a fallen god. As Louis sat in his cell, the National Convention debated what to do with him. This is where the historical evidence reveals the true nature of the mistake. Many members of the convention, particularly the Girondins, were terrified of killing the king. They knew that executing a monarch would make France a pariah in Europe. They knew it would trigger a civil war in the deeply religious provinces of the Vendée, where the peasants still viewed the king as the father of the nation. But they were trapped. To their left sat the Mountain, the Jacobins, led by the incorruptible Robespierre and the fiery Saint-Just. For the Jacobins, the king's death was a structural necessity. Saint-Just stood before the assembly and uttered the chilling words, "This man must reign or die." He argued that there was no middle ground. If Louis was innocent, then the revolution was a crime. If the revolution was right, then the king, by his very existence, was a rebel. The trial began in December 1792. It was a spectacle designed to humiliate. Louis was brought before the convention not as a sovereign, but as a criminal. They presented evidence found in an iron chest hidden in the Tuileries. letters and documents that suggested the king had been communicating with foreign powers and counter-revolutionaries. Louis defended himself with a quiet dignity that surprised his enemies. He denied the charges. He stood by his role as a constitutional monarch, and for a moment it seemed that the moderates might find a way to spare him. They proposed an appeal to the people, a national referendum to decide the king's fate. They hoped the conservative countryside would vote for exile or imprisonment over death, but the Jacobins could not allow the people to speak. They knew the power of the mob. Outside the hall of the convention, the sans-culottes gathered, sharpening their pikes, screaming for the head of the tyrant. They intimidated the deputies, whispering threats of another massacre if the vote didn't go the right way. This was not a court of law. It was a theater of intimidation. The vote was held in public, each deputy forced to stand and announce his verdict aloud, under the watchful, bloodthirsty eyes of the galleries. One by one, men who had once been loyal subjects of the crown stood up and voted for death. Some did it out of conviction, but many did it out of pure, unadulterated fear. They knew that if they did not kill the king, the mob might kill them. The historical tragedy here is that Louis had already lost. He had no army, no treasury, no palace. He was a man who spent his days teaching his son geography and reading Latin classics in his cell. He was a political ghost. By killing him, the revolutionaries did something they never intended. They turned a failed king into a martyr. They took a man who was widely seen as weak and indecisive and gave him the chance to die with a heroism he never possessed in life. The evidence suggests that even up to the final days, the majority of the French people did not want the king's head. They wanted bread. They wanted peace. They wanted the rights promised to them in 1789. But the radical factions needed a point of no return. They needed to spill royal blood so that every member of the convention would be an accomplice to a crime from which there was no turning back. It was a pact of blood designed to unite the Republic through shared guilt. As January 21st approached, the tension in Paris reached a breaking point. The city was under a total lockdown. All shops were closed. The National Guard lined the streets, 20 deep in some places, their bayonets gleaming in the grey morning light. There was a profound silence over the city, a silence born of shock and the realization that something ancient and fundamental was about to be severed. Louis spent his final night in prayer and saying goodbye to his family. The descriptions of his farewell to Marie Antoinette and his children are heartbreaking. He was no longer the King of France. He was a father being torn from his children. He promised to see them again the next morning, but he never went back. He couldn't bear the pain of another goodbye. On the morning of the execution, the fog was so thick you could barely see the tops of the buildings. A carriage waited in the courtyard of the temple. Louis stepped inside, accompanied by an Irish priest, Father Edgeworth. As the carriage rolled through the streets of Paris, the only sound was the rhythmic beat of the drums. Thousands of drummers positioned throughout the city to drown out any cries of "Long live the King." The revolutionaries were terrified that even at the last second the people might rise up to save their monarch. They were afraid of the very man they claimed was a powerless tyrant. When the carriage reached the Place de la Révolution, formerly the Place Louis XV, the king looked out at the massive crowd. In the center stood the guillotine, a new, efficient machine of death that had been adopted as a symbol of egalitarianism. It didn't care if you were a peasant or a prince. It killed everyone the same way. Louis climbed the wooden steps of the scaffold. His movements were steady, his face pale but composed. When the executioner, Charles-Henri Sanson, tried to bind his hands, Louis resisted for a moment, his royal pride flaring up one last time. But his confessor whispered to him, "Sire, in this last insult, I see only one more resemblance between your majesty and the God who will be your reward." Louis relented. He let them tie his hands. He let them shear his hair. He turned to the crowd and spoke in a loud, clear voice. "I die innocent of all the crimes imputed to me. I pardon those who have sought my death, and I pray to God that the blood you are about to shed may never be required of France." He wanted to say more, but the commander of the guard, a man named Santerre, ordered the drums to roll. The king's voice was swallowed by the thunder of the percussion. He was forced down onto the plank. The heavy blade, held aloft by a simple rope, hung for a split second in the air. In that heartbeat, the entire history of France hung in the balance. The revolutionaries believed that when the blade fell, it would cut the chains of the past and usher in a golden age of reason. They believed that by removing the head of the state, they would allow the body of the people to flourish. But they were wrong. They didn't realize that by killing the king, they were destroying the only symbol that held the nation's fragile unity together. They were replacing the rule of law with the rule of the blade. They were teaching the people that the only way to resolve a political disagreement was through the systematic elimination of the opposition. The blade fell with a dull thud. The executioner reached into the basket and held up the dripping head of Louis XVI for the crowd to see. A few cries of "Vive la République" rose from the front rows, but for many there was only a hollow, haunting silence. The blood of the king had been spilled, but the hunger remained. The wars remained. The fear remained. And as the blood soaked into the wooden planks of the scaffold, the revolution entered a new, terrifying phase. The death of Louis XVI didn't end the violence, it gave it a mandate. It was the moment the dream of 1789 began to transform into the nightmare of 1793. The Republic had been born, but its first breath was taken in a vacuum of legitimacy that would soon be filled by the Committee of Public Safety, the Revolutionary Tribunal, and a wave of executions that would make the death of the king look like a mere prelude to the slaughter. The blade didn't just kill a man, it killed the possibility of a peaceful transition, ensuring that the only way forward for France would be through a river of blood that would eventually lead to the rise of an emperor. The echo of the blade falling on the Place de la Révolution did not bring the silence of peace. It brought the roar of 1,000 new storms. As the head of Louis XVI was tossed into a wicker basket, the revolutionaries believed they had performed a surgical operation, removing a cancerous growth to save the body of France. But what they failed to understand was that they hadn't just removed a man. They had shattered a mirror in which the French people had seen their own identity for a millennium. Without the king, the Republic was no longer a dream of shared liberty. It was an empty room, and everyone was suddenly terrified of who might walk through the door next. The immediate aftermath of January 21st, 1793, was not a celebration of freedom, but the beginning of a frantic, desperate struggle for survival. The mistake was beginning to bear its poisoned fruit. Abroad, the execution sent a shockwave through the royal courts of Europe that turned a political disagreement into a holy war. Great Britain, Spain, and the Netherlands, nations that had previously hesitated to fully commit to the conflict, now viewed the French Republic as a pack of regicidal wolves that had to be put down for the safety of civilization. France was no longer just a nation in revolt. It was a pariah, surrounded on all sides by enemies who saw the death of Louis as a personal threat to their own crowns. Inside the borders of France, the situation was even more dire. In the western region of the Vendée, the news of the king's death acted like a torch dropped into a hayloft. The peasants there, deeply religious and traditionally loyal to the crown, did not see the execution as a victory for the people. They saw it as the murder of the most Christian king, their earthly father and protector. They rose in a massive, bloody insurrection, screaming the names of God and the king as they clashed with the revolutionary armies. The Republic, which had promised to bring the nation together under the banner of brotherhood, now found itself forced to wage a brutal war against its own citizens. This was the first great irony of the regicide. To protect the Republic of Liberty, the revolutionaries had to become more tyrannical and more violent than the monarchy they had just destroyed. The guillotine, which was supposed to be a tool of finality, was now just getting started. In the cold, damp cells of the Temple prison, the emotional weight of the king's death crushed those he left behind. Marie Antoinette, now referred to by the Republic as the Widow Capet, was a ghost of her former self. The woman who had once been the fashion icon of Europe, the glittering star of Versailles, was now dressed in ragged black mourning clothes, her hair turning white from the sheer stress of her grief. She sat in a room where the walls seemed to sweat with the dampness of the Seine, listening to the footsteps of the guards outside. But the cruelty of the revolution did not stop with the husband. In a move that displayed the growing paranoia of the convention, the young Dauphin Louis Charles was forcibly torn from his mother's arms. The screams of the boy and the desperate pleas of the Queen echoed through the stone corridors, but the guards were indifferent. The Republic was terrified that the 8-year-old boy would become a symbol for the Royalists, a Louis XVI, around whom the counter-revolution could rally. They decided that the best way to neutralize the child was to break him. He was handed over to a cobbler named Simon, a man instructed to re-educate the prince by forcing him to drink, swear, and sing revolutionary songs. The psychological torture of the royal family was a reflection of the Republic's own soul. It had become so afraid of the past that it felt the need to destroy even the innocence of a child. While the Queen suffered in silence, the halls of the National Convention were becoming a theatre of madness. The mistake of killing the king had created a vacuum of legitimacy that no one knew how to fill. If a king could be killed, who was safe? The Jacobins and the Girondins, once allies in the fight against the monarchy, now looked at each other with bared teeth. The Girondins, who had tried to save Louis from the blade, were now accused of being secret royalists, traitors to the people. Maximilien Robespierre, the man who had once argued against the death penalty, had been transformed by the regicide. He began to believe that for the Republic to survive, virtue must be enforced by terror. He saw enemies everywhere. The air in Paris became thick with suspicion. Neighbors began to denounce neighbors. The law of suspects was passed, a decree so vague that anyone could be arrested for their thoughts, their associations, or simply the way they looked. The Republic of Laws had died with the king. In its place was the Republic of Fear. Deep down, in the quiet moments of the night, even the most ardent revolutionaries began to feel the weight of what they had done. There is a story that some of the deputies who voted for the king's death couldn't sleep, haunted by the calm way Louis had faced his end. They had expected a coward, a tyrant, who would beg for mercy. But they had found a man who forgave them. This moral clarity from the victim made the executioners feel small. They had to keep killing to prove to themselves that they were right. The execution of the king hadn't settled the question of power. It had only escalated the stakes to a point where losing a political debate meant losing your head. The surgical strike had turned into a bloodbath, and the men who had held the scalpel were now covered in a gore they couldn't wash off. The turning point came when the revolution began to eat its own fathers. The Girondins, the very men who had helped spark the fires of 1789, were the next to be fed to the machine. In June 1793, a mob of sans-culottes, egged on by the radicals, surrounded the convention and demanded the arrest of the moderate deputies. These were the men who had dreamed of a republic based on the American model, a place of intellect and debate. But they had forgotten that once you invite the mob to kill a king, you cannot tell the mob when to stop. As they were led away to the conciergerie, the antechamber of the guillotine, one of them, Vergniaud, famously remarked, "The revolution, like Saturn, is devouring its own children." They had opened the door to a logic of total destruction, and now they were the ones standing on the threshold. The evidence of the catastrophe was now visible in every street corner of Paris. The bread lines were longer than ever, the currency, the assignats, was worthless, and the prisons were overflowing. The king's death had promised a new beginning, but it had delivered a collapse. The revolutionary leaders were trapped in a cycle of their own making. They couldn't stop the terror because the moment they stopped, they would be held accountable for the blood already shed. They had to find new enemies, new conspiracies, new aristocrats to blame for the hunger and the chaos. They even changed the calendar, renaming the months and starting the years from the birth of the Republic, as if they could erase the memory of the past by renaming time itself. But the past was not so easily forgotten. The ghost of Louis XVI haunted every decree they signed. In the conciergerie, Marie Antoinette prepared for her own trial. She was no longer the Austrian woman they had mocked in pamphlets. She was a widow whose son had been stolen and whose dignity was the only thing she had left. Her trial was a farce, even more so than her husband's. She was accused of impossible crimes, including incest with her own son, a charge so repulsive that she stood up and appealed to all the mothers in the room, momentarily silencing the bloodthirsty audience with the sheer power of her outrage. But the verdict had been written long before she entered the room. On October 16, 1793, she followed her husband's path to the Place de la Révolution. She didn't have the luxury of a closed carriage. She was forced to sit in an open cart, exposed to the insults of the crowd. Yet she sat tall, her eyes fixed on the horizon, refusing to give her executioners the satisfaction of seeing her cry. As she stepped onto the scaffold, she accidentally stepped on the executioner's foot and whispered, "Monsieur, I ask your pardon. I did not do it on purpose." Even at the edge of the abyss, the Queen of France remained more civilized than the Republic that was killing her. The death of the Queen marked the point of no return. The mistake was now absolute. By killing the King and the Queen, the revolutionaries had removed all the traditional brakes on power. There was no longer any sacred boundary that could not be crossed. The Committee of Public Safety, led by Robespierre, Danton and Saint-Just, now held absolute power over the lives of every French citizen. They believed they were creating a republic of virtue, but they were actually creating a vacuum. Every day the tumbrils rolled through the streets, carrying the old, the young, the rich, and the poor to the guillotine. The national razor was working overtime. The dream of 1789, the dream of a nation of free and equal citizens, had been buried under the weight of the regicide. The revolutionaries had thought that by killing the king, they would make the people sovereign. Instead, they had made the executioner the most powerful man in France. As the year 1793 drew to a close, a sense of exhaustion began to settle over Paris. The people were tired of the blood, tired of the fear, and tired of the empty promises of the radicals. They began to look back at the time of the king not as a time of tyranny, but as a time of stability. This was the ultimate failure of the execution. It made the monarchy look like a lost paradise. The radicals had intended to kill the idea of kingship, but they had only succeeded in making it nostalgic. The Republic was now a sinking ship, and the men at the helm were too busy accusing each other of mutiny to see the rocks ahead. The mistake of January 21st was now a debt that had to be paid, and the interest was being collected in heads. The stage was set for the final act of the tragedy, where the architects of the terror would find themselves staring up at the very blade they had sharpened for their king. By the summer of 1794, the Republic of Virtue had become a factory of death, and the city of Paris was drowning in the blood that the execution of Louis XVI had first set in motion. The mistake was no longer a matter of political theory. It was a physical, choking reality. The Place de la Révolution had been renamed the Place de la Concorde in a desperate attempt to signal peace, but the name was a lie. The guillotine had been moved to the outskirts of the city because the residents near the center could no longer stand the smell of the earth, which had become so saturated with human blood that it had turned into a permanent, putrid mire. This was the logical conclusion of the regicide. When the revolutionaries decided that a man could be killed not for what he had done, but for who he was, they had removed the only barrier between society and total annihilation. The blade was now a hungry god that required daily sacrifices. At the center of this madness stood Maximilien Robespierre, the incorruptible. He had orchestrated the king's death to secure the Republic, but he now found himself a prisoner of his own logic. To keep the Republic pure, he had to keep purging. He had sent his rivals to the scaffold, then his friends, and finally even his most loyal allies like Georges Danton. As Danton was led to the guillotine, he shouted toward Robespierre's window, "You will follow me soon." It was a prophecy born of the realization that the revolution had become a circle of fire, closing in on everyone who had started it. The historical evidence of this period, known as the Great Terror, shows a government that had completely lost touch with the people it claimed to represent. The law of 22 Prairial had stripped away the last vestiges of legal defense. There were no more witnesses, no more evidence, only the moral conviction of the judges. In a single month, more people were executed than in the entire year preceding it. The mistake of killing the king had created a machine that could not be turned off. Robespierre's descent was as psychological as it was political. He had replaced the Catholic God with a supreme being of his own invention, crowning himself as the high priest of the revolution in a bizarre festival that alienated even his closest supporters. As he stood atop a cardboard mountain, dressed in sky-blue silk, the deputies in the crowd whispered that he wanted to be the new king, a king more absolute than Louis XVI had ever dreamed of being. This was the ultimate irony. The men who had murdered a monarch because they hated the idea of one man holding power were now bowing to a lawyer who ruled through a committee of 12. The Republic of Liberty had become a cult of personality, and the personality was becoming increasingly unstable. The climax of this tragedy arrived on the 9th of Thermidor. The National Convention, pushed to the brink of extinction by Robespierre's latest list of traitors, finally found the courage of the desperate. In a chaotic session filled with screams and denunciations, they declared Robespierre an outlaw. The man who had used words as a weapon for 5 years was literally silenced. As he tried to speak, the deputies shouted him down, one of them yelling, "The blood of Danton chokes you." Robespierre fled to the Hôtel de Ville, where a botched suicide attempt or a guard's bullet, history is still divided, shattered his jaw. He was found the next morning lying on a table, bleeding, unable to speak, staring at the ceiling with eyes that saw the end of his world. The execution of Robespierre on July 28, 1794, was the mirror image of Louis XVI's death, but with none of the dignity. While Louis had forgiven his executioners, Robespierre was met with a roar of hatred that shook the buildings of Paris. When the executioner ripped the bandage from his shattered jaw to prepare his neck for the blade, Robespierre let out a scream of agony that stayed in the nightmares of those who heard it for decades. As the blade fell, the crowd didn't just cheer, they danced in the streets. They believed that by killing the architect of the terror, they were finally ending the nightmare. But the damage had been done. The foundations of the state had been pulverized. The years that followed the fall of Robespierre were a chaotic scramble for order. The Directory, the new government, was a weak and corrupt regime that lurched from one crisis to another, unable to feed the people or stop the inflation that had turned the currency into worthless paper. The mistake of January 21, 1793 was now fully visible. By killing the king, the revolutionaries had destroyed the sacred center. They had removed the only symbol that the illiterate peasants and the urban radicals could both recognize as the source of authority. Without that center, France was a ship without a rudder, caught in a storm of civil war, foreign invasion, and internal coups. The people were exhausted. They no longer cared about virtue or liberty. They wanted a man who could bring bread to the table and stop the killing. This vacuum of power was exactly what allowed a young, ambitious general from Corsica to step onto the stage of history. Napoleon Bonaparte was the final consequence of the regicide. In 1799, he seized power in a coup, effectively ending the revolution. 5 years later, in 1804, the tragedy was completed. In the Cathedral of Notre Dame, Napoleon took the crown from the hands of the Pope and placed it on his own head. He declared himself Emperor of the French. The Republic was dead. The revolution, which had begun with the hope of a constitutional monarchy, had passed through the fires of regicide and terror, only to end in a military dictatorship. The French people, who had killed a king for being too powerful, now cheered for an emperor who would lead millions of them to their deaths on the battlefields of Europe. Napoleon himself understood the irony. He once said, "I found the crown of France lying in the gutter and I picked it up with a sword." He could only do that because the revolutionaries had thrown it there, covered in the blood of Louis XVI. The historical verdict is clear. The execution of Louis XVI was the revolution's biggest mistake because it made a moderate outcome impossible. It radicalized the world against France and radicalized France against itself. It replaced the slow, difficult process of political reform with the quick, easy solution of the guillotine. If Louis had lived, France might have become a stable constitutional monarchy like Britain, avoiding the decades of Napoleonic wars and the repeated revolutions that would plague the country for the next century. But the revolutionaries chose the path of blood, believing that you can build a house of peace on a foundation of murder. As we look back at the Place de la Révolution, we see more than just the end of a king. We see the birth of a pattern that would haunt the modern world. Every time a movement decides that its ideology is more important than human life, every time it believes that the ends justify the means, it repeats the error of 1793. The guillotine remains the ultimate symbol of that failure, a machine designed to be humane that became an instrument of inhumanity. Louis XVI was an imperfect man, a flawed leader, and perhaps a failed king. But in his death he became something far more powerful, a warning. The silence that fell over Paris after the blade dropped on the last of the Jacobins was the silence of a nation that had lost its way. The revolution had promised a new heaven and a new earth, but it had only succeeded in proving that the human heart is capable of terrifying darkness when it is given absolute power and a sharp blade. The story of Louis XVI is not just a story of the past, it is a mirror. It shows us that once you start the cycle of political violence, you cannot control where it ends. It shows us that the blood of the father will eventually be visited upon the children, and most of all, it shows us that the greatest mistake any society can make is to believe that freedom can be won through the systematic destruction of the other. The king was dead, the queen was dead, the prince was dead, and the revolutionaries were dead. In the end, only the machine remained, standing silent in the dark, a grim reminder that once you invite the guillotine to the table of politics, it is always the last guest to leave. The dream of 1789 was a beautiful one, but it was murdered in the cold morning air of January 21st, 1793. The Republic was born in blood, and in blood it perished, leaving behind only the cold stone of history and the echo of a blade that still vibrates through the centuries, reminding us that some mistakes can never be undone. France would eventually find its way back to liberty, but it would take a century of pain and the lives of millions to wash away the stain of that single fatal day in Paris. The lesson of the French Revolution is written in the records of the Temple prison and the dust of the Place de la Révolution. You cannot kill a king to save a nation. You can only kill a king to start a war that no one truly wins.